If you lived in the 14th century, would you dare to take a bath? Can you imagine a life where you only bathe a few times over the course of an entire decade? Have you ever wondered? If medieval people didn't bathe, how did they not die from infections? How did they not rot inside their armor? Is it true that some nobles back then would spray perfume on dirty clothes instead of washing them? Or that a bride before her wedding night would wipe herself down with wine instead of water? And did you know that there was a time when people believed bathing could shorten your life? The Middle Ages, a time spanning hundreds of years, has long been labeled as dark, filthy, and foul-smelling. But is that the full truth? Did people really live in mud-covered villages, clueless about toothbrushes, and avoid water like cats? Or has history simply been told from the wrong angle? The amazing thing is, they survived. They gave birth, grew crops, built castles, and fought wars without antibacterial soap, peppermint toothpaste, or hot running water. So what was their secret? In this series, we'll travel back in time to uncover how medieval people kept their bodies clean, dealt with odors, survived plagues, and why not bathing often might have been a matter of survival. Get ready, because what you're about to learn might just make you look at your bottle of body wash in a whole new way. Part 1. The myth of the stinky Middle Ages. When we think of the Middle Ages, it's easy to imagine a world filled with knights, castles, and a whole lot of body odor. Popular culture hasn't helped. Movies, TV shows, and even textbooks often paint medieval people as filthy, grimy, and allergic to water. But how true is that image? Let's start by busting a myth. Medieval people weren't completely opposed to bathing. In fact, they enjoyed it. In the early part of the Middle Ages, around the 5th to 12th centuries, bathing was surprisingly common. In cities like Paris, Rome, or Constantinople, there were public bathhouses, some of them left over from the Roman Empire. People went there to bathe, relax, and socialize. It wasn't just about hygiene. It was also a bit like going to a modern-day spa. There are written records of nobles and even peasants bathing regularly, sometimes with hot water mixed with herbs like rosemary or lavender. In some towns, bathhouses had scheduled hours for men and women and even offered food and music. So where did it all go wrong? Why did that habit disappear and leave behind a legacy of people who never bathed? The answer lies in what came after those early medieval centuries. Religion, disease, and fear began to change everything. But before we get there, here's something you might not expect. In many homes, yes, even among peasants, people washed their faces, hands, and feet daily. They changed linen underclothes often, and they didn't all smell like barns. They just didn't bathe the way we do now, full-body showers every day with scented soap and shampoo. They worked with what they had, and what they had was actually not that bad. It turns out that the idea of medieval folks being permanently covered in grime is mostly a modern misunderstanding and maybe even a bit of historical arrogance. Back then, personal hygiene was more practical than luxurious. People didn't have showers, of course, but they wiped down with cloths, washed with basins, and used herbal rinses when available. Think of it as the original sponge bath, no plumbing needed. Even in rural villages, it wasn't uncommon for someone to heat water over a fire and pour it into a wooden tub for a bath. Whole families might share the same water, yes, but it was still an effort to stay clean. And here's something interesting. Laundry was more important than bathing. Clean clothes, especially fresh linen worn close to the body, were considered key to staying healthy and fresh. People believed that changing their undergarments regularly helped draw out impurities from the skin. In a way, that idea wasn't far off. Clean fabrics probably did help reduce bacteria. But what about smells? Well, medieval people didn't have deodorant, but they did use natural fragrances. Lavender, rosemary, sage, and rosewater were common. Nobles carried pomanders, little scented balls of herbs, to mask bad odors in crowded cities. And yes, some even sprinkled perfume on their clothes between washes. As for dental hygiene, chewing aromatic twigs, rinsing with salt water or vinegar, and using cloth to rub the teeth were all part of the routine. No mint toothpaste, but they tried. So why do we still imagine them as dirty? One reason: the centuries after the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-1300s, many people became suspicious of public bathing. Bathhouses were seen as places where diseases might spread. Or worse, where immoral behavior occurred. Over time, the fear of illness and sin started to outweigh the desire to be clean. So, let's review what we've uncovered so far. Medieval people did wash, just not in the way we do today. Bathing was actually enjoyed and even ritualized in early medieval culture. People valued clean clothes, herbal scents, and basic cleanliness of the face, hands, and feet. There were public bathhouses, home tubs, and even homemade soaps made from lye and animal fat. So where did the dirty medieval myth come from? A big part of it comes down to how history is written and who writes it. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, thinkers in Western Europe wanted to separate themselves from what they saw as a dark and ignorant past. And so, they painted the Middle Ages as a time of filth and superstition. Dirty people, dirty cities, dirty minds. It made the new thinkers seem more modern, more enlightened, more clean. Add to that the growing influence of Victorian standards centuries later, when even talking about your body was considered inappropriate, and suddenly, earlier centuries looked downright disgusting by comparison. But the truth is far more nuanced. Medieval people weren't spotless, but they weren't savages either. They had their own logic, customs, and reasons behind everything they did or didn't do. And things were about to get more complicated. Because by the 14th century, something happened that would change the way people thought about water, the body, and even the soul. Part 2. When bathing became a threat, religion, fear, and the Black Death. In the 14th century, a storm swept across Europe. Not a storm of wind or rain, but of fear. It began in 1347, when the Black Death arrived. Within just a few years, it wiped out over one-third of Europe's population. Entire villages vanished. Streets were filled with the sick, the dying, and the dead. People were desperate to understand what was causing this, and how could they protect themselves, with no understanding of germs or bacteria. Medieval medicine turned to theories of the time, many based on religion, humors, and air. One popular belief: that water opened your skin's pores, making you more vulnerable to bad air, what they called miasma. This invisible miasma was believed to carry death itself. So what did people do? They stopped bathing. Public bathhouses, once places of cleanliness and relaxation, were now seen as danger zones. A warm bath? That was like opening your body to poison. Even worse, bathhouses were often associated with sinful behavior, especially when men and women bathed together. The church didn't like that. Some religious leaders began preaching that clean skin could lead to a dirty soul. The more you focused on physical beauty, the more you were straying from God. So gradually, washing the body was replaced with other rituals: prayers for protection, wearing holy charms, fumigating homes with incense or herbs, and covering bad smells, not with water, but with perfumes, vinegar cloths, and scented sachets tucked into clothing. In this new world, smell was everything. If someone smelled clean, it didn't mean they had bathed. It meant they had masked their body well. And for many, that was enough. Even nobles, once fond of rosewater baths and perfumed oils, now turned to powders, dry scrubbing, and scented gloves. Bathhouses were shut down, some even burned. And the very act of bathing came to feel suspicious. But here's the twist. People were still trying to stay clean, just in different ways. Wiping with cloths, changing undergarments, rinsing feet and hands. Those routines quietly continued, even in the age of fear. In some ways, medieval people weren't unhygienic. They were just scared, and adapting the only way they knew how. Imagine living in a time when just drawing a bath could spark fear in your heart, when stepping into warm water didn't feel soothing, but risky. That's the world people were thrown into after the plague struck. And the fear wasn't just of disease, it was also of temptation. You see, bathhouses weren't always just for bathing. In many towns, they became associated with prostitution and sexual activity, especially when men and women bathed together or when certain bathhouses doubled as brothels. This gave religious leaders the perfect platform. To them, physical indulgence was a doorway to moral decay. Clean skin, in their view, could lead to unclean thoughts. Better to be clothed in modesty and dust than risk the sin of vanity. Church teachings slowly began to discourage not just public bathing, but even private washing, unless it was for medical reasons or religious purification. Monks in some orders were even praised for avoiding baths entirely. Dirt was seen as a sign of spiritual devotion, of resisting the pleasures of the flesh. And for everyday people, well, they listened, because the plague had shown them what death looked like up close. And they weren't about to take any more chances. Add to that the collapse of many Roman-style bathhouse infrastructures and urban plumbing systems after centuries of war and instability, and bathing became not just spiritually suspicious, but logistically difficult. Yet despite all this, people didn't give up on hygiene completely. They adapted. They adjusted. They tried to balance fear with function. And while full-body baths became rare, other forms of cleanliness persisted quietly in the background. In small ways, medieval people held on to dignity, even in a world filled with superstition, sickness, and sermons about sin. It's easy now, centuries later, to look back and wonder, how could people live like that? But we have to remember, they weren't choosing dirt over soap. They were choosing safety over danger, virtue over vanity, life over risk, at least by the logic of their world. In fact, some even believed that the stronger your smell, the more holy you were. Saints were described as having bodies so consumed by the spirit that they no longer cared for earthly things like baths. Dirt became symbolic. And in a time when death seemed to linger in the very air, avoiding water became a kind of spiritual armor. Still, not everyone conformed. In southern Europe, especially places influenced by older Roman traditions, bathing culture held on longer. Some Italian cities kept public bathhouses running into the Renaissance. Doctors in Islamic regions continued to promote hygiene as part of health, based on ancient Greek medicine and the teachings of the Quran. But overall, the tides had shifted. By the late Middle Ages, the once simple act of washing the body had become tangled in fear, theology, politics, and class. And even as the plague faded, the suspicion around bathing lingered. For many centuries, the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness didn't apply to your skin, it applied to your soul. But humans are resilient and resourceful, and even without bathtubs, shampoos, or daily showers, medieval people found clever ways to stay just clean enough to survive. Part 3. Life without soap. Medieval hacks for staying kind of clean. Even though they didn't bathe every day, feared water, and didn't have modern shampoo, soap, or deodorant, medieval people didn't all smell bad. So, how did they manage to stay somewhat clean? First, let's look at what they had and how they used it. Soap wasn't completely unknown in the Middle Ages. But it wasn't the fragrant, gentle soap we know today. It was often made from animal fat mixed with wood ash, creating a harsh soap that could dry and roughen the skin. Because of that, it was more commonly used for washing clothes than bodies. Instead, people preferred gentler methods like using clay to absorb oils from the skin or rinsing with herbal waters made from rosemary, sage, or lavender. They also used vinegar or wine washes, believing these could disinfect and refresh the body. Among the nobility, soap bathing was even less popular. They often wiped themselves down with cloths soaked in scented waters, a kind of medieval sponge bath. While full-body baths were rare, spot cleaning was common, washing hands and face daily. especially before meals, was standard for both hygiene and religious reasons. Feet were often washed before bed, sometimes with the help of family or servants. Underarms and private areas were wiped or rinsed with herbal water. They weren't spotless by today's standards, but they weren't covered in filth either. It was about managing dirt, not completely eliminating it. Another clever trick was keeping clothes clean to help the body feel cleaner. Undergarments like linen shirts worn next to the skin were washed regularly, even if outer layers were not. They understood that clean clothes absorbed sweat and oils, reducing body odor. When it came to hair care, they didn't have fancy shampoos, but had their own solutions. Combs were essential tools, used frequently to remove lice and dirt. Vinegar rinses helped degrease and freshen hair. Herbal powders like dried rosemary or lavender masked odors. Some used henna or lye-based washes to clean or dye hair. Braiding hair or covering it with scarves helped keep it clean longer. Without deodorant, people had to get creative to manage body odor. They carried small scented sachets filled with herbs and flowers inside their clothes. Pomanders, decorative balls filled with spices, were worn around the neck or waist. Perfumed gloves, rosewater sprays, and even orange peels tucked into sleeves were common. The goal wasn't to eliminate body odor completely, but to mask it. Everyone had a natural smell. It just wasn't a problem unless it was too strong. So, medieval people weren't perfectly clean by modern standards, but they weren't dirty either. They did the best they could with what they had. In a world where water was feared, soap was suspect, and plumbing was primitive. Despite the lack of modern soaps and showers, medieval people were surprisingly resourceful when it came to maintaining a level of cleanliness that was acceptable in their time. Their daily routines focused less on full immersion baths and more on practical, manageable ways to stay fresh throughout the day. One important aspect was the regular washing of hands and face, especially before meals and religious ceremonies. This was not just about cleanliness, but also about ritual purity, which played a significant role in daily life. Hands, being the most frequently used and exposed part of the body, received special attention, often cleaned with water infused with herbs or scented oils. Feet, too, were carefully tended. Medieval footwear often trapped moisture and dirt, so washing feet before sleep helped prevent infections and discomfort. Sometimes, this task was done by servants or family members, demonstrating the importance of foot hygiene even when full-body bathing was rare. Hair care, although limited by the absence of shampoo, was surprisingly thorough. Combing was a daily necessity, not just to keep hair tidy, but to control lice infestations, a common problem at the time. Vinegar rinses helped break down oils and freshen the scalp, while dried herbs sprinkled into hair served to mask odors. Head coverings such as scarves or caps were also practical tools, helping to keep hair clean by protecting it from dust and grime. Another crucial factor was clothing hygiene. Since frequent full-body washing was uncommon, wearing clean undergarments helped absorb sweat and oils, keeping the skin beneath more comfortable and less prone to irritation. Changing linen shifts and washing them regularly was considered a basic hygienic practice, even if outer garments saw less frequent cleaning. To manage body odor without deodorants, medieval people relied on aromatic herbs and spices. Small sachets filled with dried lavender, rosemary, or mint were tucked into pockets or sewn into clothing. Pomanders, small containers filled with fragrant spices, were carried or worn to provide a pleasant scent throughout the day. Such practices reflect how masking odors, rather than eliminating them, was the primary goal. All these habits might seem primitive now, but they were effective adaptations to the cultural, religious, and technological realities of the medieval world. Water was often unsafe or considered unhealthy, soap was harsh and scarce, and plumbing was nearly non-existent. Within these constraints, people developed practical hygiene routines that helped them survive and function in society. In the next part, we'll explore even more personal care practices of the medieval world, including how they dealt with dental hygiene, waste, and the delicate matters of menstrual care. Part 4. Beyond the bath. Medieval dental care, toilets, and other hygiene realities. When we think of medieval hygiene, images of grimy streets and dirty people often come to mind, but the reality was more complex. Personal care extended far beyond bathing, and people developed surprisingly practical ways to manage everyday needs like dental health and waste disposal, even without modern conveniences. Dental care in the Middle Ages was rudimentary but present. While there were no toothbrushes as we know them, people used twigs or small sticks chewed at one end, called chew sticks, to clean their teeth. Herbal powders made from crushed mint, sage, or salt were rubbed onto teeth and gums to freshen breath and help prevent decay. Barbers sometimes doubled as dentists, pulling teeth or treating mouth infections. Despite these efforts, tooth decay and gum disease were common, partly due to diets high in sugars and coarse bread. Toilets, or rather, latrines, were another challenge. Most medieval homes didn't have indoor plumbing. Wealthy castles had garderobes, small rooms with wooden seats built over a shaft that emptied into a moat or cesspit. Peasants used simple pit latrines or even went outdoors. Public latrines existed in some towns, often communal and basic. Waste management was primitive, which sometimes led to foul smells and the spread of disease, especially in crowded cities. Menstrual hygiene was an often unspoken but important part of women's lives. Women used cloth rags or homemade pads made from soft fabrics, which were washed and reused. In wealthier households, linen or wool might be used. There was also knowledge of herbal remedies to ease discomfort or manage symptoms, reflecting a blend of practical care and traditional medicine. The medieval approach to hygiene was heavily influenced by religious and cultural beliefs. Water was sometimes seen as a source of illness rather than a cure, leading to caution or avoidance of bathing. Yet cleanliness was associated with spiritual purity, so washing hands, face, and feet before prayers or meals was a ritual practice. These contradictions shaped daily habits. In sum, while medieval hygiene lacked the ease and thoroughness of modern standards, people adapted impressively. They used available natural resources and cultural customs to care for their bodies as best they could. Their hygiene practices tell us a lot about their lives, values, and the challenges they faced. Beyond just the practical side of medieval hygiene, the beliefs and superstitions of the time had a profound impact on how people cared for their bodies. Medicine and hygiene were often intertwined with spiritual and magical thinking, which could both help and hinder health. Beyond just the practical side of medieval hygiene, the beliefs and superstitions of the time had a profound impact on how people cared for their bodies. Medicine and hygiene were often intertwined with spiritual and magical thinking, which could both help and hinder health. For example, many medieval people believed that water could carry disease through the body's humors, the four fluids thought to govern health. Bathing too often, or immersing oneself fully, was feared to open the pores and let illness in. This fear made regular bathing unpopular, especially among the wealthy, who preferred wiping down with cloths or using fragrant oils instead. At the same time, certain herbs and potions were highly valued for their supposed cleansing and protective powers. People bathed their hands or faces in water infused with rosemary, lavender, or thyme to ward off evil spirits and infection. Sachets of aromatic herbs were carried not just to mask odors, but to protect against the miasma believed to cause plague and other illnesses. Toilets and waste disposal were surrounded by taboos and practical concerns. Cesspits had to be emptied regularly, and their contents sometimes sold as fertilizer, showing an early form of recycling. However, the smell and risk of contamination made waste a constant worry, particularly in growing towns. Even menstrual hygiene was influenced by superstition. Menstruating women were sometimes thought to have special powers, but were also feared or excluded from certain activities or places, reflecting deep cultural ambivalence about natural bodily functions. Despite these beliefs, medieval people developed many hygiene habits grounded in observation and experience. They knew, for example, that washing hands before meals reduced sickness, and that clean clothes helped prevent skin infections. This blend of practical knowledge and superstition shaped medieval life in profound ways. It also highlights how far we've come in understanding hygiene, not just as physical cleanliness, but as part of a broader system of health, culture, and belief. Medieval medicine was a curious mix of observation, superstition, and tradition when it came to hygiene. The medical theories of the time played a huge role in shaping daily practices. The dominant idea was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which had to be kept in balance for good health. Illness was often seen as the result of an imbalance, and hygiene was one way to maintain that balance. Doctors and healers advised against excessive washing, believing that too much water could wash away the body's natural oils and upset the humors. This was one reason why full baths were infrequent and sometimes discouraged. Instead, they recommended dry cleaning methods, like rubbing the skin with cloths, powders, or herbs. At the same time, cleanliness was linked to preventing the spread of miasma, or bad air, which was thought to cause disease. To combat this, people burned incense, carried scented pomanders, and surrounded themselves with fragrant herbs. Public health measures like cleaning streets and disposing of waste were primitive, but aimed at reducing foul smells and unhealthy environments. During times of plague or epidemic, hygiene became even more critical, though often misunderstood. Some believed that water could worsen the disease by opening pores, while others emphasized the importance of fresh air and cleanliness. This led to conflicting advice and practices, but it showed how hygiene was deeply connected to survival. Medical practitioners also used herbs and natural remedies to cleanse wounds and prevent infection. Plants like rosemary, sage, and garlic were popular for their antiseptic properties. Even if the scientific basis wasn't known, this blend of folk knowledge and early medical practice formed the backbone of medieval hygiene care. In short, medieval hygiene was shaped by a complex web of medical theory, religious belief, and practical necessity. While many ideas now seem strange or mistaken, they were part of a genuine effort to stay healthy in a challenging world. Next, we will explore how these medieval hygiene practices influenced social life and culture, from the rituals of washing to the stigma around dirt and cleanliness. Part 5. Cleanliness and Culture. How hygiene shaped medieval social life. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying healthy. It was deeply woven into social customs, religious beliefs, and ideas about status. Cleanliness had meaning far beyond the physical. It influenced how people were perceived, how they interacted, and even how communities functioned. In medieval society, personal hygiene was a reflection of one's morality and social standing. Nobles and wealthy merchants, for example, were expected to maintain a certain level of cleanliness and grooming as a sign of their status. Wearing clean clothes, using perfumes or scented oils, and maintaining tidy hair showed refinement and respectability. Conversely, poor hygiene could lead to social stigma and assumptions about one's character. Religious rituals also emphasized cleanliness. Washing before prayers, touching holy objects with clean hands, or bathing before significant religious events were practices linked to spiritual purity. This connection between physical and spiritual cleanliness reinforced hygiene habits even when bathing was rare. Public bathhouses existed in some towns and cities, serving as social hubs where people bathed, relaxed, and mingled. However, these places had a complicated reputation, sometimes seen as healthful retreats, other times as hotbeds of disease or immoral behavior. During outbreaks of plague or other illnesses, bathhouses were often closed to prevent contagion. Moreover, medieval ideas about dirt and cleanliness extended into the language and literature of the time. Terms like filthy or unclean didn't just describe physical dirt, but were used to express moral judgment or social exclusion. Hygiene became a metaphor for purity, order, and civilization. Despite the challenges of limited technology and knowledge, medieval people developed customs and rituals around hygiene that helped structure daily life and social relations. Cleanliness was a way to assert identity, demonstrate respect, and navigate the complex social world of the Middle Ages. As we continue, we'll look at specific examples of hygiene rituals and daily routines across different medieval regions and classes, revealing the rich variety and surprising sophistication of their practices. In addition to social status and religion, hygiene in medieval times was also deeply connected to gender roles and family life. Women, especially, played a central role in maintaining cleanliness within the household. They were responsible for washing clothes, preparing herbs and scented waters, and ensuring that living spaces were kept tidy. This domestic labor was essential, not only for health, but for the family's social reputation. A well-kept home was a source of pride and a reflection of the woman's virtue and skill. Men, on the other hand, often faced different hygiene expectations. While nobles might have access to private baths and grooming services, common men typically focused on practical cleanliness related to work and public appearances. For example, a merchant or craftsman would wash hands frequently to maintain hygiene and impress clients, but might not bathe fully as often. Children's hygiene was also considered important, though again shaped by social and economic factors. Parents tried to keep infants and young children clean, but lack of running water and proper facilities made this difficult. Still, herbal baths and gentle washes were common, reflecting an understanding of the importance of care from an early age. The public sphere was another area where hygiene and culture intersected. Marketplaces, churches, and festivals were crowded and lively, but also presented hygiene challenges. Towns often organized communal efforts to clean streets and dispose of waste, especially after markets or religious celebrations. These activities helped reduce odors and disease risks, and fostered a sense of community responsibility. Interestingly, despite common assumptions, many medieval people did value cleanliness and made efforts to maintain it within the limits of their environment and knowledge. Their hygiene practices, whether through ritual washing, use of herbs, or careful clothing care, reveal a culture that balanced practical health concerns with spiritual and social meanings. Understanding medieval hygiene is not just about recognizing their limitations, but appreciating how these practices shape daily life, relationships, and identity. It reminds us that hygiene, then as now, is a complex mix of biology, culture, and belief. Beyond the household and social norms, medieval hygiene also influenced was influenced by the design of living spaces and towns. Homes, castles, and monasteries were often built with practical features to support cleanliness, despite the lack of modern plumbing. For example, many castles included garderobes, primitive toilets built into walls with chutes leading outside or into moats. Monasteries emphasized ritual washing and had special basins for hand washing before meals and prayers. The layout of medieval towns and cities also reflected concerns about hygiene. Narrow, winding streets with open gutters carried waste away from homes. However, the lack of organized sewage systems often meant that waste accumulated in the streets, contributing to foul smells and the spread of disease. Efforts to clean streets and manage waste were communal responsibilities, with town councils imposing fines on those who littered or dumped waste improperly. Markets and public gatherings posed particular hygiene challenges. Vendors often sold food in open-air stalls, and animals were kept close to human dwellings. This proximity increased the risk of contamination but was a practical necessity for trade and daily life. Regulations sometimes required vendors to maintain cleanliness or separate livestock from market areas, showing an early form of public health awareness. Interestingly, hygiene practices varied significantly between regions and social classes. In wealthier urban centers, access to bathhouses, scented waters, and fine linens was more common, while rural populations relied on rivers, wells, and homemade soaps from animal fats and ashes. Cultural attitudes towards bathing and cleanliness also differed. Some cultures embraced frequent washing, while others emphasized modesty and restraint. The complexity of medieval hygiene practices highlights how deeply intertwined they were with social structure, religion, economy, and environment, far from being simply dirty. Medieval life included many thoughtful adaptations to maintain health and social order. As we move forward, the next section will explore how medieval hygiene practices evolved over time and influenced later developments in public health and sanitation. Part 6. From medieval hygiene to modern sanitation, the evolution of cleanliness. Medieval hygiene practices laid important foundations, but the journey toward modern sanitation and public health was long and complex. Many ideas and customs from the Middle Ages persisted for centuries, influencing attitudes about cleanliness, disease, and community responsibility. One key turning point came during the Renaissance and early modern periods, when scientific understanding began to challenge old beliefs. The theory of the four humors slowly gave way to discoveries about germs and infection. Still, for a long time, misconceptions about water and bathing lingered. Some doctors continued to warn against frequent washing, fearing it opened the body to harm. Cities gradually improved their infrastructure, building better sewage systems and public baths. The growth of urban populations made waste management a critical issue, prompting innovations like paved streets, underground sewers, and organized garbage collection. Public health ordinances emerged, regulating hygiene in markets, homes, and workplaces. The link between hygiene and disease prevention became clearer with the work of pioneers like John Snow, who traced cholera outbreaks to contaminated water sources in the 19th century. These breakthroughs sparked a hygiene revolution. Bathing became more frequent, clean water was prioritized, and sanitation became central to public policy. Yet, even as science advanced, cultural and social attitudes toward hygiene continued to shape behavior. Traditions, religious beliefs, and economic factors all influenced how people cleaned themselves and their surroundings. Looking back, the medieval approach to hygiene was a complex blend of practical knowledge, cultural values, and spiritual beliefs. While some ideas now seem outdated, they reflected genuine efforts to protect health in challenging conditions. Today, modern sanitation and hygiene practices owe much to this long history. From the communal bathhouses and herb gardens of the Middle Ages to today's water treatment plants and hand sanitizers, the story of cleanliness is one of continuous learning and adaptation. The slow shift from medieval hygiene practices to modern sanitation didn't happen overnight. For centuries, the connection between cleanliness and health remained clouded by superstition, religious doctrine, and limited scientific knowledge. Yet, the medieval emphasis on cleanliness, whether driven by spiritual purity or practical necessity, planted important seeds. During the Renaissance, the revival of classical learning brought renewed interest in anatomy and the human body. Physicians like Andreas Vesalius challenged old medical dogmas, encouraging direct observation and experimentation. This scientific curiosity gradually eroded mistrust of bathing and hygiene. Meanwhile, cities began to face growing public health challenges as populations swelled. Overcrowding, poor waste disposal, and contaminated water fueled outbreaks of deadly diseases like plague and cholera. These crises forced authorities to develop rudimentary sanitation systems, ordinances, and public health measures to control epidemics. Despite advances, many people clung to medieval beliefs about water and illness. Bathing was sometimes feared as a risk rather than a benefit. It wasn't until the 19th century, with breakthroughs in microbiology and epidemiology, that the germ theory of disease gained acceptance. Pioneers such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that microorganisms caused infections, revolutionizing hygiene and sanitation. Public health reforms followed. Clean water supply, sewage treatment, garbage collection, and public education on personal hygiene became standard. Bathing became routine, and hygiene was recognized as a cornerstone of disease prevention. Interestingly, some medieval practices survived or even influenced modern hygiene. The use of herbs for cleansing and fragrance, the importance of fresh air, and the communal nature of bathing found echoes in later health movements. This continuity reminds us that hygiene is not just a scientific matter, but a cultural and social one. Understanding this historical progression highlights how hygiene evolved from medieval customs steeped in superstition into a vital public health science. It also underscores the human capacity to adapt knowledge and habits in response to new challenges and discoveries. Even as the Renaissance ushered in scientific curiosity, many medieval beliefs about hygiene lingered well into the 17th and 18th centuries. People continued to debate the risks and benefits of bathing, often influenced by cultural norms and religious teachings. For instance, some Protestant groups viewed frequent bathing as vanity or even sinful, preferring modesty and restraint. Others embraced elaborate bathing rituals as a symbol of wealth and refinement. Urbanization also complicated hygiene efforts. Growing cities struggled with the sheer volume of waste and the spread of infectious diseases. Without proper sewage systems, human and animal waste frequently contaminated water sources, fueling deadly epidemics. It became clear that hygiene was not just an individual responsibility but a public concern. In response, local governments began implementing more organized sanitation measures. Streets were cleaned regularly, waste disposal was regulated, and public bathhouses were sometimes supervised to ensure cleanliness. These efforts laid the groundwork for the modern concept of public health. The breakthrough came in the 19th century with the development of germ theory. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister demonstrated that microorganisms cause disease and that cleanliness could prevent infection. This scientific foundation transformed hygiene from a mix of tradition and superstition into an evidence-based practice. Suddenly, practices such as hand washing, sterilization of medical instruments, and clean water supply became essential tools in combating disease. Public health campaigns promoted these behaviors widely, reshaping social attitudes toward bathing and sanitation. Despite this progress, cultural habits and access to resources still influenced hygiene practices. Wealth and education affected who could maintain personal and environmental cleanliness. Yet, the recognition of hygiene as a public good led to investments in infrastructure like water treatment plants, sewage systems, and garbage collection services that benefit societies worldwide today. Reflecting on this evolution reveals how medieval hygiene was both a product of its time and a crucial stepping stone toward modern health standards. The struggles and innovations of the past continue to inform our understanding of cleanliness, disease prevention, and community well-being. In the next part, we will explore some fascinating medieval hygiene tools, remedies, and daily routines that reveal the creativity and resilience of people living in that era. Part 7. Tools, Remedies, and Daily Rituals, How Medieval People Stayed Clean. Medieval hygiene might seem primitive by today's standards, but people of the time used a surprising variety of tools and natural remedies to maintain cleanliness and health. Their daily routines reflected both practical needs and cultural beliefs, combining nature's resources with human ingenuity. One of the most common hygiene tools was the basin and pitcher. Without running water, people filled basins with water brought from wells, rivers, or springs and used pitchers to pour water for washing hands, face, or feet. Simple cloths or sponges helped remove dirt. In wealthier households, these vessels were often made from ceramics or metals like pewter or silver, sometimes beautifully decorated. Soap, although different from modern formulas, was known and used. especially by the wealthy. Medieval soap was typically made from animal fats combined with wood ash or lime. Some recipes included fragrant herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask odors and provide a refreshing scent. Soap making was a skilled craft, and soap was a valuable commodity often sold in markets. Herbs played a crucial role in hygiene and health. People used fragrant plants not only to scent the air and bodies, but also for their antiseptic properties. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, mint, and sage were common additions to baths or infusions for washing. These herbs helped combat unpleasant smells, and some believed they could protect against illness. Bathing itself varied greatly depending on time, place, and social status. Many people took sponge baths or washed key areas of the body regularly, while full immersion baths were less frequent. Public bathhouses were available, provided spaces for washing, socializing, and relaxation. Some bathhouses featured heated water, steam rooms, and massages, making them centers of medieval wellness. Clothing hygiene was also important. Changing and washing undergarments and outer clothes helped reduce body odor and skin infections. Wealthy individuals might own several sets of clothes and employ servants for laundering. Common folk did laundry less frequently, but still valued clean clothing when possible. Toilets, or privies, varied from simple holes dug outside the home to more elaborate garderobes built into castle walls. These rudimentary facilities helped manage human waste, but were far from hygienic by modern standards. Some castles had waste chutes that emptied into moats or pits, while towns often relied on cesspits that required regular cleaning. Despite these challenges, medieval people showed resourcefulness and care in maintaining hygiene. Their tools and remedies reveal a rich tradition of self-care shaped by environment, culture, and belief. Beyond the basic tools and soaps, medieval people also relied heavily on natural remedies to combat odors and maintain skin health. Vinegar, for example, was widely used as a cleansing agent, known for its antibacterial properties. It was applied to the skin and even used to rinse hair. Some believed that vinegar could ward off miasmas, the foul airs thought to cause disease. Another interesting practice was the use of perfumes and aromatic oils. Since bathing was infrequent for many, these scents helped mask body odors. Wealthier individuals often carried small pomanders, scented balls, or containers filled with herbs and spices to refresh themselves throughout the day. This practice showed an early awareness of personal scent hygiene. Medieval diets also influenced body odor and skin condition. A diet rich in herbs, grains, and fresh produce contributed to overall health, while heavy consumption of meat and alcohol sometimes exacerbated unpleasant smells. This connection between food and hygiene reflected a holistic approach to well-being. Daily routines for washing varied widely. Nobles might enjoy lavish baths heated with wood-fired boilers, complete with attendants to assist. Commoners often washed in cold water, using basins and cloths to clean essential areas. Foot washing was common, especially after traveling or working outdoors. Hair care was another important aspect. Long hair was sometimes considered unclean if left unmanaged, so combing, braiding, and washing were common practices. Some people applied herbal rinses or oils to keep hair healthy and fragrant. Interestingly, communal bathing in public bathhouses also served social and therapeutic functions. These establishments were places to relax, meet others, and enjoy massages or steam rooms. However, concerns about morality and the spread of disease sometimes led to restrictions or closures of bathhouses, especially during plague outbreaks. Clothing hygiene involved regular airing of garments to prevent mildew and odor. People sometimes sprinkled herbs or lavender in their wardrobes to keep clothes smelling fresh. Laundry was labor-intensive, often done by women, using water, ash, and beaters to clean fabrics. Medieval hygiene was clearly a complex system of tools, remedies, and practices adapted to available resources, beliefs, and social structures. Despite limitations, People demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of cleanliness that balanced practicality with cultural meaning. In the next part, we'll examine how hygiene practices differed across various regions and social classes during the medieval era, revealing a rich tapestry of diversity in cleanliness. Part 8. Hygiene across regions and social classes, the diversity of medieval cleanliness. In medieval times, hygiene practices varied widely depending on where people lived and their social status. Geography, climate, cultural traditions, and wealth all shaped how individuals and communities approached cleanliness. In rural villages, access to clean water was often limited. People relied on nearby streams, wells, or rainwater for washing. Bathing might be a seasonal event, more common in warmer months when water was plentiful. Without dedicated bathhouses, rural folk practiced basic washing at home, focusing on key body parts like hands, face, and feet. Dirt and grime from outdoor labor were a constant challenge. So clothes washing and airing became important to maintain comfort and health. In contrast, urban centers, especially larger medieval cities, offered more opportunities for public hygiene. Public bathhouses were common fixtures, though their availability varied by region and city regulations. These communal baths provided spaces not only for cleansing, but also for socializing and relaxation. However, overcrowding and poor sanitation sometimes turned bathhouses into breeding grounds for disease, leading to closures or strict controls during outbreaks. The climate also influenced hygiene habits. In colder northern regions, full-body bathing was less frequent, with more reliance on dry cleaning methods like brushing the skin and changing clothes. In warmer southern areas, frequent bathing was more practical and customary. Social class played a significant role in hygiene as well. Nobles and wealthy merchants had greater access to water, soap, perfumes, and attendants who assisted with bathing and grooming. Their clothing was changed and cleaned more regularly, and they often owned elaborate toiletries and grooming tools. Bathing was sometimes a luxurious ritual, part of leisure and status display. Peasants and laborers, on the other hand, faced harsher conditions. Their daily work was physically demanding, and their limited resources meant simpler hygiene practices. Baths were infrequent, and clothing was washed less often, primarily due to the difficulty of obtaining clean water and soap. Religious communities such as monasteries emphasized cleanliness as a spiritual discipline. Monks and nuns maintained regular washing routines, often with access to better facilities than the general population. Their hygienic practices were tied to rituals of purity and health, reflecting the intertwining of body and spirit. Cultural differences also emerged. For example, in the Islamic world during the medieval period, hygiene was highly emphasized, with detailed guidelines for washing and bathing as part of religious practice. This contrast with some European attitudes highlights the diversity of medieval hygiene across the globe. Understanding these regional and social variations helps paint a fuller picture of medieval life. Hygiene was not a single, uniform practice, but a mosaic shaped by environment, economy, culture, and belief. Beyond the basic distinctions between rural and urban hygiene, regional customs added rich layers to medieval cleanliness practices. In Northern Europe, where colder climates prevailed, people often preferred dry cleaning methods, such as brushing and airing out clothes and bedding to avoid the discomfort of cold water baths. These practices were sometimes supplemented by the use of fragrant herbs tucked into clothing or beds to mask odors and repel pests. In Southern Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean, the warmer climate encouraged more frequent bathing. The legacy of Roman baths persisted in some cities, where bathhouses continued to serve as social hubs. In parts of Spain and Italy, influenced by Islamic culture during the Middle Ages, the emphasis on regular washing and ritual purification was particularly strong. This included not only full-body baths, but also regular washing of hands and face throughout the day, which tied closely to religious practices. Social hierarchy also deeply influenced access to hygiene. The nobility and wealthy merchants could afford not only private baths but also luxury soaps, perfumes, and grooming tools imported from far-flung regions. They often employed servants to assist with washing, hair care, and laundering. Lavish bathing rituals were both a matter of health and a display of status, with some nobles hosting elaborate bathing ceremonies. Peasants and laborers, by contrast, faced harsher realities. Daily toil exposed them to dirt, sweat, and grime, yet their limited resources constrained bathing frequency. Washing focused on essentials like hands and face, often using cold water. Clothes were washed infrequently, mainly due to the scarcity of soap and water. Yet, despite these challenges, many peasants developed ingenious ways to maintain cleanliness, such as airing clothes by the fire or using natural brushes. Religious orders played a vital role in setting hygiene standards. Monasteries often had well-maintained washing facilities and promoted daily cleansing as part of spiritual discipline. Monks' and nuns' routines included ritual washings and frequent hand-washing before meals, which contributed to comparatively better hygiene within monastic communities. Interestingly, hygiene was also tied to morality and social order. Cleanliness could signify virtue, self-control, and respectability, especially among the upper classes. Conversely, neglecting hygiene was sometimes linked with moral failings or social marginalization. Recognizing this diversity helps us understand that medieval hygiene was far from monolithic. It was a complex interplay of environment, culture, religion, and social status shaping how people cared for their bodies and surroundings. In the next section, we will explore how the devastation of the Black Death prompted shifts in hygiene awareness and public health policies that changed medieval society forever. Part 9. The Black Death's Impact. How the Plague Changed Medieval Hygiene and Public Health. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century was a cataclysmic event that reshaped medieval society in countless ways, including how people understood hygiene and public health. This devastating plague, which wiped out an estimated one-third of Europe's population, forced a grim reckoning with the realities of disease transmission and cleanliness. Before the plague, hygiene practices were often guided more by tradition, superstition, and social customs than by scientific understanding. The concept of germs was centuries away from discovery. However, the scale and horror of the Black Death sparked urgent efforts to control infection, even if the causes remain mysterious. One of the most immediate effects was a heightened awareness of cleanliness. People began to associate foul smells and visible filth with disease, leading to greater efforts to clean streets, homes, and public spaces. Some cities implemented ordinances to remove garbage and animal waste from streets and mandated the cleaning of market areas to reduce contamination. Bathhouses, which had been centers of social life, faced suspicion during plague outbreaks. Many believed these places, with their close contact and shared water, could spread disease. Consequently, some bathhouses were closed, and bathing frequency declined temporarily. Ironically, this may have worsened hygiene overall, as people avoided washing out of fear. The plague also led to the development of quarantine measures. Ships arriving at ports were required to isolate for periods, initially 30 days, later 40 days, hence the term quarantine. From the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. These early public health policies reflected an emerging understanding of disease control through isolation, even without full knowledge of pathogens. In homes, people adopted new practices to reduce contagion. Herbal fumigations, using smoke from burning aromatic plants like rosemary and juniper, became common to purify the air. Individuals also increased the use of perfumes and vinegar washes to combat bad air, believed to carry illness. The Black Death's devastation prompted gradual changes in sanitation infrastructure. Some towns improved waste disposal systems and sought better water sources to reduce contamination. Although these improvements were slow and uneven, they laid groundwork for future public health developments. Overall, the plague shattered complacency about hygiene and disease, sowing seeds for later advances in medicine and public health. While medieval understanding remained limited, the Black Death marked a turning point, pushing societies to rethink cleanliness and community health. As the Black Death ravaged medieval Europe, the sheer scale of death and suffering forced communities to reconsider long-held beliefs about cleanliness and disease. The plague's mysterious nature, striking swiftly and lethally, bred fear and uncertainty, but also motivated innovation in how people manage their environments. Cities, struggling with overcrowding and poor sanitation, began experimenting with urban hygiene reforms. Authorities recognized that accumulated waste, stagnant water, and filth provided breeding grounds for disease-carrying pests like rats and fleas, though the exact role of these animals was unknown at the time. Efforts to clear refuse from streets, regulate markets, and separate living spaces from waste disposal areas gradually gained importance. Medical practitioners, though lacking modern germ theory, recommended practical steps to reduce exposure. Physicians advised patients to avoid crowded places, keep windows open for fresh air, and bathe less frequently during outbreaks to prevent opening the pores to disease. These contradictory ideas reflected the struggle to reconcile tradition with the harsh realities of the plague. The rise of quarantine stations at ports and city gates marked a breakthrough in containment strategies. Officials established designated areas where travelers and goods were held until deemed safe. This early form of disease control helped slow the plague's spread and demonstrated an unprecedented level of public health organization. Religious and cultural responses also shaped hygiene practices. Many saw the plague as divine punishment, leading to increased rituals of purification and penance. At the same time, some communities improved personal cleanliness as a form of protection and spiritual discipline. The long-term impact of the Black Death on hygiene extended beyond immediate crisis management. The epidemic accelerated shifts toward cleaner urban environments, greater awareness of disease vectors, and more structured public health policies. These changes, though uneven and gradual, influenced medieval society's evolving relationship with cleanliness, health, and communal responsibility. In the following section, we will explore how these developments paved the way for Renaissance innovations in medicine and sanitation, bridging medieval traditions with emerging scientific understanding. Part 10. From medieval to Renaissance, the evolution of hygiene and public health. The devastating aftermath of the Black Death set the stage for a slow but profound transformation in hygiene and public health practices as Europe transitioned from the medieval era into the Renaissance. This period witnessed growing curiosity, scientific inquiry, and an increasing emphasis on empirical observation that gradually reshaped people's understanding of cleanliness, disease, and medicine. During the Renaissance, cities became more aware of the importance of sanitation. Urban planning began to incorporate wider streets, better drainage systems, and more regulated waste disposal. Some cities introduced early forms of public water supply and sewer systems to improve hygiene and reduce disease risk. These infrastructural advances marked significant progress compared to the cramped, filthy medieval towns. Medical knowledge expanded as scholars revisited ancient texts and began to question traditional beliefs. The invention of the printing press helped spread new ideas about anatomy, health, and disease. Though the germ theory of disease would not be formally established until centuries later, Renaissance physicians started to emphasize cleanliness in medical practice, recommending regular washing of hands and instruments. Bathing habits also evolved. While the fear of contagion during plague outbreaks had reduced bathing temporarily, the Renaissance brought a renewed interest in personal hygiene. Wealthier classes embraced bathing as both a health practice and a luxury, often constructing elaborate private baths. Soap production improved, making cleansing products more accessible. Public health measures grew more systematic. Quarantine continued to be refined. And some cities began to maintain health boards or commissions responsible for monitoring outbreaks and enforcing hygiene regulations. The concept of isolating the sick and controlling the movement of people became foundational to epidemic response. Religious institutions remained influential, but secular authorities increasingly took responsibility for public health. This shift reflected broader changes in governance and society as science and reason began to challenge superstition and tradition. Though progress was uneven and many medieval hygiene practices persisted, the Renaissance marked a pivotal turning point. It laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of disease prevention and the vital role of hygiene in protecting communities. Continuing from the advances in hygiene and public health during the Renaissance, certain individuals and inventions completely transformed how people understood and practiced cleanliness. Scientists and medical pioneers like Paracelsus began challenging classical beliefs and emphasized the role of chemistry and personal hygiene in preventing disease. Soap-making techniques improved, making soap more accessible to the general public, which encouraged more frequent hand-washing and bathing habits. At the same time, the invention of the printing press rapidly spread medical and hygiene knowledge like never before, reducing superstition and increasing scientific understanding among the population. Guides on personal hygiene and environmental cleanliness were published and widely circulated. Although challenges remained, the world was gradually entering a new era where hygiene was no longer just a personal matter, but an essential part of public health policy. From the hard lessons of the Middle Ages and the Black Death, humanity learned the vital importance of maintaining cleanliness to protect community health. Conclusion: hygiene in the Middle Ages, though often misunderstood and underestimated, is actually a complex story interwoven with culture, religion, society, and ecological conditions. Medieval people did not bathe as frequently as we do today, but they had their own ways to maintain cleanliness and prevent illness within the limits of their knowledge. The Black Death marked a crucial turning point, driving changes in awareness and hygiene practices that laid the foundation for inventions and improvements during the Renaissance and beyond. Hygiene became an inseparable part of public health and modern medical science. Understanding the past helps us appreciate the progress we enjoy today and reminds us that maintaining personal and environmental hygiene remains a solid foundation for health and sustainable societal development.